Welcome back everyone. Today we're gonna watch the second part of Oversimplified's World War One video. I think we were stuck in 1914, I think just when the trenches began to form. And yeah, let's waste no further time, let's dive right into this.
With both sides stuck in a hard stalemate, they knew this war wasn't going to be about taking territory, but about simply wearing each other down.
I think that's one of the major reasons why they refused to make peace for such a long time, or why I think both sides did not want to make a deal, let's say, and have this war end with no decisive winner, even though for the most part of the war it wasn't really didn't really go into anyone's direction, at least not completely. Because if you waste a bunch of your soldiers' lives in order to basically not gain anything, you're not gonna want to say, okay, we're just gonna stop and admit that this was pretty much completely pointless. So yeah, unfortunately, this was gonna drag on for another few years.
The Allies had plenty of men to expend from its overseas dominions, and the British also started a naval blockade, so Germany couldn't import stuff, like food. Neither side really wanted a long, grueling war, though, so they both thought of ways to break the deadlock on the Western Front. Idea number one, new frontiers. When the war first broke out, Australia was quick to take German New Guinea. The Allies also quickly jumped on Germany's colonies in Africa, and particularly in German East Africa, locals were enlisted as soldiers and carriers by both sides, leading to a tragic loss of life for the native Africans. Some new combatants entered the war as well. The Allies' new friends were Italy and Japan. Japan was busy building itself an empire, so it was more than happy to take away German islands and colonies in East Asia. Italy actually had an alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary before the war, but after some tense relations, and then the Allies promising to give them some of Austria-Hungary's stuff, they switched sides.
Yeah, I think the colony part was obviously, since Germany had fewer colonies, so there were less soldiers in those colonies, and because they were blockaded by the British, so they couldn't send any of their, of the German soldiers that were stationed in Germany into those or to those colonies, which obviously I don't think they would have done either way because they obviously were busy fighting on the Western Front. That, made sure that those German colonies would be pretty quickly taken over by the Entente powers.
Italy opened up a front in the mountains here, but like everyone else, they were stuck in stalemate for most of the war. The Central Powers' new friend was a struggling empire in the Middle East. The Ottoman were divided on whether to actually join the war or not, since they had been exhausted by the recent Balkan Wars. Some of the politicians who did want to join went off on their own and fired some shells at Russia, and then came back and said, whoops, looks like we're at war now. The Ottoman entry into the war was of particular concern to the British, since the Middle East was full of oil, and Britain wanted all of that oil. First, the Ottomans tried to attack Russia in the Caucasus Mountains, but they weren't prepared for the cold, and many of them froze to death. Then they crossed miles of desert to take the Suez Canal from the British, but that failed too. Then the Allies tried to take the Dardanelles at Gallipoli in a long and hard trench warfare campaign, but that also failed.
I think Winston Churchill was actually one of the major military leaders at the time, and he would go on to obviously get back his reputation only later. But after the First World War, it was pretty much pretty bad, I think, because that was a very humiliating defeat, or at least a bad defeat for the British. And yeah, but obviously he would go on to become British Prime Minister during the Second World War.
Blamed their initial losses on the ethnic Armenians living within Ottoman territory, and the resulting Armenian genocide led to the deaths of 1.5 million people. Then the Germans sent spies into Afghanistan to try to convince the Arab tribes there to rise up in jihad against the British and attack India. But that plan failed, partly because the spies got bored, brewed their own alcohol, and got drunk, which is a bad thing to do in Afghanistan. All these new frontiers hadn't done much to change the war. Aware that the Allies had more men and supplies than them, the Germans knew they had to do something to break the stalemate. Before the war, there was a bit...
Yeah, I mean, for Germany, obviously, due to the blockade, but obviously also just because they were outnumbered, they knew that the longer this war would go, the worse their chances of success would be. And, the Schlieffen Plan, which was their initial strategy, at least, which was talked about in the first video, was to pretty quickly win the war in France and knock them out to then focus on Russia. And yeah, now that they would, well, now that France was not gonna lose that easily, at least not as easy as they lost in 1870 and 1871, yeah, the Germans were kind of bogged down in trench warfare and were kind of desperate to find any sort of solution, but because they knew that if they wouldn't find one, then this war would be a defeat for Germany.
Conference that set out the rules of modern warfare. No chemical weapons, no killing civilians. Basically, don't be jerks. The Germans held a meeting and decided to be jerks. Zeppelin air raids commenced over British cities. They also started attacking the Allied trenches with chlorine gas, and they used submarines to sink civilian ships. One such civilian ship was the Lusitania, which had 159 Americans on board when it was sunk, further swaying US opinion against the Germans. Not to be completely unfair to the Germans, the Allies also engaged in chemical warfare soon after, and they had been hiding anti-submarine weapons on their civilian ships, which let the Germans justify their attacks. Meanwhile, Austria-Hungary still hadn't dealt with Serbia, so the Central Powers enlisted some help. Bulgaria wished it was bigger and was still bitter about losing the Second Balkan War. The Central Powers promised to make all of Bulgaria's wildest dreams come true if they helped, so they signed on, and together they knocked out Serbia. The Serbian troops retreated through Albania, which was neutral but had some ties to Austria-Hungary.
Yeah, there were a few wars in the Balkans before World War One, and I think that people would have probably thought that World War One would be just another war in the Balkans at first, but obviously since Austria-Hungary was now invading Serbia, and because of all the different coalitions, it eventually drew all the major European powers into this war. But yeah, I think from 1900 more or less to 1914 there were like 3 different Balkan wars. First it was a bunch of Balkan countries gaining their independence from the Ottoman Empire, and then it was Bulgaria wanting to take over everything pretty much, and then being defeated, and so now they want their territories back that they've lost in the war before. So they're going to join the Central Powers to gain some territory from Serbia, mostly.
Entered Albania in a friendly invasion to chase down the Serbians, many of whom escaped by sea. It's 1916, and a lot is happening. As if they didn't have enough enemies already, Germany added one more to the list. Portugal had been getting a bit chummy with the Allies behind the scenes, and Germany didn't like that one bit.
I think Portugal was allies with Britain since 13 something. I think it's the oldest friendship between two countries, the oldest continuous friendship, I think, in history. So yeah, obviously they would join, but it's not like they were any close to the Western Front, since Spain was neutral, so.
Time, the only sea battle of the war happened. Both sides had a new powerful class of battleships called dreadnoughts, but they were so expensive to build that neither side wanted to risk losing them in a battle, so they kept them in port, except for one time when they had a big fight and a bunch of them got damaged, so they didn't.
It's interesting because Germany obviously was building a really large naval fleet to not only make sure that they were, could reach their colonies more efficiently, but also to, rival the British. Which is a reason why the British were sort of alienated by the Germans and didn't want to, or was sort of against German expansion at the time, since not only was Germany the largest military power in Europe, but they also tried to rival the British at sea. And I think a British policy at the time was to make sure that the Royal Navy, which is the largest navy in the world at the time, was twice as large as the second and third largest navy in the world, which throughout the 19th century was the French and the Russian navy, respectively. So they always tried to make sure that the French and the Russian navy combined was still smaller than the British. And obviously now that Germany is the new, the new big power in Central Europe, they wanted to make sure that the German Navy was not going to be a problem. And yeah, still both didn't want to fight on sea, since obviously ships are expensive and they didn't want to risk it. But yeah, in this case, they had one battle.
Again, the UK started conscripting men to the army, so they had plenty of reserves, which is just as well because the Western Front was about to get brutal. The longest and one of the bloodiest battles of the war started when the Germans launched an attack around the French city of Verdun. The French defended it desperately, leading to hundreds of thousands of casualties. Under pressure, the French called on its allies to do something to draw the Germans' attention away, so the British started their own long and brutal fight, the Battle of the Somme, with 60,000 British casualties on just the first day. It was also here that the British first used one crazy brand new piece of sci-fi technology. The Russians had been getting pushed back.
Yeah, tanks would obviously become the main weapon of war in the Second World War. But yeah, I mean, this just shows how war can cause immense technological innovation. Obviously, during World War II, the atomic bomb would be invented, and during World War One, it was tanks, which would go on to, you know, be extremely important in especially World War II. Obviously, these earlier tanks were breaking down often, and since it wasn't really the open field battles that you would see in World War II with the trenches, they wouldn't become as much of a factor as they were in World War II. But obviously, they were still massively impactful on the Western Front.
Further and further into their own territory. But in response to the French call for help, they began a huge offensive, and did really well until they ran out of supplies and got stuck. Seeing how well the Russians had been doing, Romania decided now would be a great time to jump in and win the war. And then they got pounded. The Greeks were fighting amongst themselves about whether to join the war or not. The king liked the Central Powers, while the Prime Minister wanted to join the Allies. After a brief national schism, during which the country split into two, the king finally abdicated and the country reunited. They began a new offensive. In the Middle East, Russia was pushing into Ottoman territory from the north. The British had also made a landing in Mesopotamia to protect Persia's oil fields, and they had also sent a small army up the Tigris River to try to take Baghdad, but the army got sieged in the town of Kut along the way, and eventually surrendered. A new offensive was launched from the south with all-out desert warfare. The offensive was aided by one famous British officer, better known as Lawrence of Arabia, who helped lead the Arab tribes in a revolt that wreaked havoc on the Ottoman supply lines. By the time 1917 rolled around, everyone was exhausted. There were mutinies in the French army, the German populace was starving, and the war had drained all of Russia's supplies. There was no clear...
Yeah, I think the mutinies in France were pretty brutally put down. There were 200 French soldiers, about 200, which got executed for treason because they mutinied. But obviously you don't want to have infighting if you're fighting a total war. Any sort of mutiny or, you know, would be put down. I mean, the extreme examples of that would also happen in the Second World War, especially in Germany and the Soviet Union and Japan, of course. But yeah, already, you know, noticeable in World War One.
And it was still anyone's war. The only question now was, who was going to break first? And the answer was Russia. Tired of not eating and mad that a crazy magic homeless guy was calling some of the shots, there was an uprising in Petrograd complete with riots and strikes.
15.
The riots turned into a full-scale revolution and a new government overthrew the Tsar. Then a few months later, the Bolsheviks overthrew the new government, and they pulled Russia out of the war. This was great.
And they had to make a pretty humiliating peace with Germany, obviously, since they've lost that much territory, and Germany wasn't even pushing that far in. I think they were still, you know, a lot further in the west, but I think that was like a third of their population, which they would have lost if that treaty would have come into effect, if Germany didn't go on to lose in the west.
For Germany, who now only had to focus on the Western Front. But there was still one problem. The pesky United States of America was looking increasingly like it was going to join the war. America had been selling supplies to the Allies throughout the war and was getting super rich off the back of it, meaning it was in fantastic shape and was dangerous to the Germans. So Germany sent a telegram to Mexico saying, wouldn't it be crazy cool if you guys attacked America? But the British intercepted the message, showed it to the Americans, and that was the final straw. American troops began shipping out to Europe. This was
Yeah,
terrible
that was a major mistake on Germany's part.
for Germany, and they knew their only hope now was to force France and the UK to surrender before the fresh American troops arrived. It was now or never, so they started one final attack. They converged their troops and hit hard at the Somme and pushed the Allies back. They hit a second time further north, then again and again. With each hit, the Germans were spending more and more resources, while the Allies were getting better and better at repelling their attacks. By the fifth punch, the Allies held the line and even pushed back. With American troops now arriving in larger numbers, the Allies launched a counterattack, and that was it. The Central Powers were being pushed back on all fronts. Bulgaria collapsed first, followed by the Ottoman Empire, then Austria-Hungary, and finally on November 11, 1918, at 11 o'clock, Germany surrendered. At the peace treaty, Germany was forced to reduce its military, accept war guilt, and pay the bill for the war. After indescribable suffering and millions dead,
17 million, that's insane. I think those numbers have only been seen at the time in Chinese civil wars or Chinese rebellions. I think those were the only real conflicts where you would see numbers to that scale. And I think, to put that into perspective, the entire Napoleonic Wars cost 3 million lives, I think. And those were like over 15 years or 20 years, depending on whether you count anything before Napoleon's coronation as part of the Napoleonic Wars. But those cost 3 million lives. The 30-year War from 1618 to 1648, I think also cost about 3 to 5 million lives, and that was 30 years. And now we're talking about a little more than 4 years. And yeah, I mean, insane numbers obviously would be more than doubled by the Second World War. But yeah, that's why it was called the war to end all wars in this case, because that had not been seen in Europe at any point in history.
the world learned its lesson and never had such an awful war again
Yeah, well, if only it had.
for about 20 years.
All right, yeah, that was World War One by Oversimplified. Obviously, we've got World War Two down here already being suggested. I'm gonna check that out next. And yeah, so it's a fascinating conflict, I think, often overlooked because obviously the world that we live in nowadays was for the most part created by World War Two. But World War One, obviously, it brought the end of 4 major empires, those being Russia, the Ottoman Empire, which obviously had been, a major power for 600 years at that point, nearly, 500 years. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the German Empire, of course. And with those, it also brought the end to the Romanov dynasty, the Hohenzollern dynasty, the Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled major parts of Europe for 600 years. And I don't know what the Ottoman dynasty was called. But yeah, pretty much the end to the old order in Europe. Absolute monarchies being replaced by republics or, communists in Russia, which obviously, if you think about a scenario where World War One didn't happen, it's fascinating to think about what the world looked like, since obviously, if you compare Europe in 1900 to 1950, let's just say, after the Second World War, they're completely different. Europe is in a completely different position when it comes to the world, and obviously within Europe, there are countries that haven't been there before. Countries are, for the most part, Europe's less powerful than it was. So, yeah, it's fascinating. Obviously, that was all kicked off by World War One, and that was the conflict that would kickstart the 20th century and would bring a new age to the world. So yeah, that was my reaction. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.